It is late 2025. NASA has completed Artemis 2, orbiting the moon successfully on the Lunar Gateway, and is now ready to land on the moon with SLS and Orion. Starship and Lunar Starship are preparing to fulfill their job of landing the astronauts on the moon and also intercepting the Lunar Gateway. But first, Lunar Starship needs to be refueled in LEO. And this is proving to be a much more complex task than SpaceX has anticipated. Although Starship's reusability has proven to be far superior than anything that came before it, for example, the fastest turnaround time of a Falcon 9 booster to that point was 51 days. Starship has been turning around in as little as 28 days. However, this kind of turnaround is not nearly good enough in order to refuel Starship as quickly as it needs to be refueled. Therefore, multiple Starships being launched both from Boca Chica and Cape Canaveral and a space launch platform out at sea is necessary in order to carry out the 13 refueling missions that are necessary for this mission. SpaceX, of course, had hoped that it would require fewer refueling missions in order to reach the moon and return to LEO. However, this has not proven to be the case, both because of the delta V required to execute all of these maneuvers and also the fuel slosh issue. Just like liquid natural gas tankers have significant problems if their tanks are not entirely full or entirely empty, the Starship proves very difficult to maneuver when its tanks are not completely full, and NASA insists that Lunar Starship be as full as possible before astronauts are risked on board. Therefore, 13 refueling missions are found to be necessary. So the schedule is tight, launching one Starship every 2 weeks for 26 weeks, and launch windows simply cannot be missed. However, the process is tedious, difficult, and frustrating. SpaceX has a challenging time carrying out the refueling missions because of this fuel slosh issue. The Starship receiving the fuel is simply difficult, if not impossible, to maneuver, much as satellites are when they're not completely full of fuel and have fuel slosh issues and are therefore unstable. Lunar Starship suffers from the same issues while undergoing LEO refueling. Therefore, it is up to the tanker to do all of the maneuvering, and Lunar Starship has to stay put during the process. SpaceX has been stretched to its limits, reusing Starships, reusing Super Heavies, launching Starships and Super Heavies, carrying out LEO refuelings all simultaneously while managing its Starlink network and all of its other operations at the same time. It is incredibly challenging to carry out this tight of a schedule, one Starship launch every 2 weeks, while doing everything else that is necessary. But SpaceX pushes forward and is being highly successful thus far, with 8 successful LEO refuelings being completed. However, the 9th refueling mission is experiencing unusual difficulties. Several missions have been scrubbed due to weather or people straying into the flight zone at inopportune times. Then, a couple of hours before launch, a minor fault is detected in the fuel system. This fault cannot be thoroughly tracked down, nor can it be conclusively proven that this represents any kind of danger to the flight. And since it's an unmanned flight, SpaceX decides to press ahead, and this proves to be a fatal mistake. The tanker Starship explodes a few hundred meters above the sea platform and almost completely destroys it. NASA, panicking, understandably, insists on a complete investigation into the matter, and Artemis is delayed for 18 months. During this time, a substantial percentage of the fuel in Lunar Starship boils off into space, and Artemis 3 comes to a grinding halt. My name is Jordan Wright. I was born in the same year that the human race took its first steps on the surface of another world, and then we promptly betrayed those people's legacy by never going back. But now, over half a century later, there's a new breed of pioneers that are seeking to finish what these people set out to do so long ago. So it's time for commentators like me to stop being polite and start getting angry! So let me make one thing abundantly clear. This video is not about how the whole concept of Starship isn't going to work. Rather, this is a video about a better way of making Starship practical and making it efficient. Having a rushed timetable of multiple refueling launches is going to be a difficult thing to carry out, in my opinion, especially given the fact that propellant boil-off is going to be an issue with any Starship that remains in orbit for too long. There's an easy solution to this, something I've talked about a number of times in the past, and that is a fuel depot. But before I talk about that, let's get into the things that I talked about in that scenario that I just described. It is true that fuel slosh represents a significant problem to satellites today. It isn't just a matter of minor difficulties. Any satellite that has its tanks partially full are challenging to maneuver, and any sort of reaction control system designed to move a satellite about, adjust where it's pointing, that sort of thing, encounters significant issues if the tanks are not completely full or nearly empty, which is the same problem that natural gas tankers have in the same situation. They roll unpredictably on the ocean if their tanks are not completely full. Therefore, in my opinion, the idea of partially fueling Lunar Starship, a vehicle that's going to be carrying human beings, is taking an unnecessary risk. Now, arguably, this problem could be solved by partitioning Starship's fuel tanks into a number of different sections. In other words, perhaps a launch section, and a maneuvering section, and a landing section, and a takeoff and dock with a gateway section, all of which could be completely full at the time of these operations being carried out. However, that would complicate the fuel delivery system tremendously and make the whole Starship design something that would require a lot of work and perhaps a lot of delays. And then, of course, there's the propellant boil-off issue. Now, liquid methane doesn't boil off very fast, but liquid oxygen is worse, and the fact of the matter is, in order to stop boil-off, you need an active cooling system, better insulation, and a sun shield. All of these things would add a tremendous amount of weight to Starship. So the better solution is to have something that has all of these features in orbit and capable of carrying enough fuel to completely refuel Starship in one go, and it can also maintain that fuel in orbit indefinitely. Is this possible? Well, yes. NASA has been working on this actually for an extremely long time. This particular video, for example, which is just about unscrewing a fuel cap in space, is 8 years old. Everybody has realized for a very long time that on-orbit refueling is going to be an absolute essential to exploring the solar system, and not only for ambitious projects like that, but also keeping satellites in orbit. Satellites' reaction control systems eventually run out of fuel, and when they run out of fuel, their orbits decay and they re-enter the atmosphere. And during that time, they're also out of control and essentially dangerous pieces of space junk. The way to avoid that is to continue refueling them indefinitely, or at least extend their lifespan considerably, and also give them the fuel they need to deorbit themselves when their operational life comes to an end. So this is an idea that's been worked on for an extremely long time, and 2 years ago, this was the result: the smallest fuel depot in history, or essentially an orbital water can. Nicole Mann used this device created by OrbitFav to transfer water from the fuel depot into the ISS's water system. The first time anything like this has ever been done in orbit to our knowledge. And since that time, actually June of this year, OrbitFav deployed the first on-orbit fuel depot. Now, this thing is not very ambitious. It is well insulated. It has solar panels for an active cooling system, but it's only used to refuel microsatellites. That's about all it's capable of. And that's not even the most accurate statement in the world, because this thing cannot actually refuel anything. It's sort of a pilot program designed to dock with another satellite without actually carrying out any refueling. The next stage in this test is going to involve a satellite that can actually refuel things. This is something that's designed more for docking than anything else. So really, we have a long ways to go when it comes to this technology. So when Elon says that doing this is going to be simpler than docking with the ISS, he's kind of making a guess. That little test on the ISS that Nicole did cannot conclusively tell us whether or not all of the fuel slosh effects that are going to result from on-orbit refueling is going to destabilize the two vehicles involved in the fueling process so much that they tumble out of control. The whole process could be immensely complicated. We really don't know until we do it. And when it comes to carrying out a complicated refueling between two starships with hundreds of tons of fuel involved, it could prove to be a lot more complicated than we're thinking. We don't know until we actually do it. The benefits of this technology, however, are tremendous. We can refuel entire satellite constellations, extending their lifespan tremendously and also eliminating the possibility of them becoming space junk. We could really wipe out any future space junk completely if we embrace this technology wholeheartedly. However, predictably, human beings don't think ahead, and we have thousands of satellites up there that have no fuel left and are a massive hazard, and the problem is getting worse by the day. And of course, fuel depots have advantages beyond just refueling existing satellites and keeping them in orbit longer. They also can fuel satellites and other vessels to go to higher orbits or all the way to the moon. And this is what OrbitFav has in mind: a fuel depot designed to send satellites to geosynchronous orbit or all the way to the moon. And this is something that will be launched next year. And as you can see, it has solar panels to power its active cooling system and multiple fuel tanks. In my opinion, that's an extremely important feature for any fuel depot. Not one gigantic tank that can be partially full and thus vulnerable to fuel slosh, but a bunch of separate tanks, all of which can be completely drained with every servicing, therefore not subjecting the satellite to any instability. And as I said, this can help facilitate moon missions and missions to geosynchronous orbit. But once again, only for satellites. We need to supersize this thing. How? Well, here's an idea that you may have seen before. It's a Starship supertanker as envisioned by the folks over at SpaceX Vision, my friends there, and you can find their link in the description. Please support them. But as you can see, it's a supersized Starship covered in solar panels, a lot of insulation, and the capability of carrying up to 2,000 tons worth of cargo. It's something that is assembled in sections, and so it would be carried up by Starship piece by piece and assembled in orbit. At least in my opinion, that would be the easiest way to do it. In theory, you might be able to put this thing on top of a Super Heavy. However, its aerodynamic qualities, given that it is much larger than a Starship, might be problematic. Assembling it in orbit and then fueling it up there might be the best solution. But the advantage that this offers is it would have the active cooling system and insulation necessary in order to keep the fuel on ice indefinitely, so you wouldn't have to adhere to a very tight schedule. It would have its own ion engine, so it could maneuver itself if necessary. And one of the things that I think that it would need, though, and I'm not sure if this is built into the concept, is multiple tanks inside it. Not one gigantic fuel tank that could be emptied slowly and therefore subject to fuel slosh, but rather a bunch of smaller fuel tanks inside of it that would be drained bit by bit and also fueled up bit by bit. It could also, as you can see, be used to resupply the ISS and other space stations, and also, as you can see, its components could be assembled in orbit and brought up piece by piece, which might make the entire process easier, or perhaps it could be launched by a Super Heavy, as you're seeing here, although that might be a difficult prospect given its size. The supertanker also has its own fairing, so it can carry up an additional piece of cargo on top of the fuel that it carries to make it more economically viable. So it serves as both a cargo ship and a fuel tanker. And on top of that, it has the ability to refuel an entire Starship and still have hundreds of tons left over. This is really the best solution. Not necessarily this in particular. I think it might need a lot more solar panels in order to cool that much fuel and keep it safe from any sort of propellant boil off. And as I said, it's going to need multiple tanks as opposed to one giant tank, but I think that this is very much on the right track. The potential with this kind of system is immense. As you can see here, asteroid mining is going to be simply impossible without this kind of technology. It takes at least 95% of a rocket's mass just to get it to LEO, and then only 5% of its mass remains to go beyond Earth's orbit. How the hell is that practical? You need to do on-orbit refueling if we want to effectively explore the solar system with larger things than tiny probes. So asteroid mining will only be possible if we use things like what Orbit Fab is creating right now. And yet, we're not working hard enough on this. We've known about this problem forever, and yet we are only just beginning to make the necessary tests to make this a reality. And in the meantime, we're letting our satellites run out of fuel in orbit and become tremendous hazards. And just to be clear, this is going to be a tremendous challenge. This is not going to be easy. This is not going to be simpler than docking with the ISS. Sorry, Elon, but it isn't. And I'm going to show you why. As you can see here, I've already said a lot of this stuff. The necessity of refueling satellites is going to be an absolute essential when it comes to keeping our orbital space safe from space junk and a future disaster. We absolutely need to have a refueling system in place in order to prevent some sort of catastrophe or chain reaction in LEO. But here's the other problem. When it comes to refueling in outer space, you just can't hook it up to a tank the way you do here on Earth. The problem is, like the problem with everything in orbit, is propellant boil-off. any sort of fluid that's exposed to the heat of the sun is going to be subject to this kind of boil-off. Consequently, the bubbles that get created when boil-off occurs do not rise to the surface as they do on Earth. There is no gravity to affect them that way, which means bubbles from the boil-off can block the transfer. This is a very, very potent threat to on-orbit refueling. This means that in all probability, a stainless steel can with minimal insulation and no active cooling system is not going to work. It is going to be blocked up by the effects of propellant boil-off and fuel slosh. As a result, you're going to need something that is specifically designed for refueling. In other words, a fuel depot with excellent insulation and an active cooling system powered either by a lot of solar panels or perhaps a nuclear reactor. It's not easy for me to say this. It's not easy for me to say that this whole concept of using multiple tankers, regular starships, to effect this refueling is not going to be practical, but it just isn't. We need a better solution, and a fuel depot is our best solution. And we need to be pushing forward with this now, not only for Starship, not only for Artemis, but also for our goals of going to Mars or just about any place else. And what really pisses me off is the fact that we haven't been pushing forward with this. We haven't been working nonstop on on-orbit refueling, in spite of the fact that we've known for a long time that we've needed this. As usual, we are not taking the action that we have to, but instead are doing only what's necessary to satisfy lobbyists, politicians, and the contractors who profit from them, instead of what's beneficial to our exploration of the solar system. Before I conclude, here comes our awesome sweepstakes winners. For those of you outside the United States, I have something special coming for you, so don't despair. But here's our winners, and thanks for playing. Over 2,000 people entered in, so if you won, you beat some serious odds. Fourth place goes to Mark Miller. Third place goes to David Iosano, and I may be mispronouncing that. Second place goes to Catherine McKee, and first place goes to Henry Bordeaux. I will be emailing all of you congratulations, and I will be listing your names in the description. Of course, not your emails, just your names, and you will be getting some very cool merchandise here soon. So if you like what I do and you like supporting this channel and my opinions, you know how to support me. It's all in the description. So until we have a full-fledged fuel depot in orbit to support our expeditions and our ambitions to explore the solar system properly, I urge all of you to stay angry about space.